Imagine car prices skyrocketing, factories shutting down, supply chains falling apart. But what if I told you this is not a prediction? It is already happening. Canada just fired back at the US, and the auto industry is in crisis. In this video, we will break down how Canada's Counterstrike is crushing American automakers, and why Tesla and Ford are panicking. And here is the real shocker. Canada still has one final move left that could turn this into an all-out economic war. Stick around, because this changes everything. What's happening? The North American supply chain was carefully built under agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and its successor, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Factories in Detroit relied on raw materials from Ontario, and assembly lines in Tennessee depended on precision components from Quebec. This interdependence kept costs down, supported thousands of jobs, and allowed both nations to compete with global auto giants like Japan and Germany. But that system was suddenly thrown into chaos when the United States government imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian auto parts, steel, and aluminum. The White House justified this move by citing national security concerns, arguing that too much dependence on foreign imports, even from an ally like Canada, put American manufacturing at risk. Some policymakers also saw tariffs as a way to pressure American companies into reshoring production, bringing jobs back to the United States. Automakers, suppliers, and economists quickly sounded the alarm, warning that this policy would do more harm than good. Instead of reviving American manufacturing, these tariffs would increase production costs, force automakers to cut jobs, and make new vehicles significantly more expensive for consumers. The auto industry operates on razor-thin profit margins, meaning even a small increase in material costs can have massive financial consequences. But despite these concerns, Washington stood firm, refusing to reconsider the tariffs. But what Washington did not expect was Canada's aggressive counterstrike, Canada's immediate countermeasures. Canada had long been known for its measured and diplomatic approach to trade disputes, often choosing to negotiate rather than retaliate. But this time was different. Faced with a direct attack on its manufacturing sector, the Canadian government acted swiftly and decisively, announcing its own set of tariffs aimed directly at American auto parts, agricultural products, and key raw materials. These tariffs were not random. They were strategically chosen to target industries and states that relied the most on trade with Canada. Lawmakers in Washington might have thought Canada would back down, but Ottawa knew exactly where to apply pressure. By imposing a 25% tariff on American auto parts, Canada struck at the heart of an industry that employs over 1 million Americans. The tariffs also extended to agricultural exports, a move designed to put pressure on rural states that had backed the White House's tough trade policies. Canadian officials understood that if farm states like Iowa and Wisconsin started losing money due to decreased exports, politicians in Washington would feel the heat. Meanwhile, additional duties on key raw materials like chemicals and plastics created ripple effects across various industries, further increasing costs for American manufacturers. The immediate impact was chaos. American automakers, already struggling with supply chain disruptions, suddenly faced higher costs on both sides of the border. The tariffs created a domino effect, with manufacturers forced to either absorb the costs, cutting profits, or pass them on to consumers, making cars even more expensive. Some smaller suppliers, unable to handle the financial squeeze, shut down entirely, leading to layoffs and factory closures. This tit-for-tat battle hit one industry harder than any other, the auto sector. The auto industry's crisis begins. No industry felt the impact of this trade war more than automotive manufacturing. The North American auto industry had evolved into a highly efficient, interconnected ecosystem, where materials and components crossed the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolled off the assembly line. With tariffs suddenly driving up costs at every stage, that system was thrown into turmoil. American automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis depend heavily on Canadian raw materials, including steel, aluminum, and high-tech electronic components. Before the tariffs, these materials flowed seamlessly across the border, allowing for efficient production. But with an extra 25% added to those costs, factories in the United States were forced to rethink their entire supply strategy. The impact was immediate and severe. Production costs soared, forcing automakers to either cut costs elsewhere or raise prices on new cars. Some manufacturers slowed production, waiting to see if the tariffs would be lifted, while others looked for alternative suppliers. a process that could take years and billions of dollars in investment. At the same time, auto parts suppliers, which provide everything from engine components to braking systems, were hit even harder. Unlike major automakers, many suppliers operate on thin profit margins and cannot afford sudden cost increases. Some small and medium-sized suppliers shut down entirely, unable to absorb the financial blow. This, in turn, created a ripple effect, delaying production and reducing the availability of essential components. While manufacturers struggled to adapt, workers bore the brunt of the fallout. Factory shutdowns, layoffs, and reduced shifts became the norm as companies scrambled to cut costs. In places like Detroit, Michigan, and Lordstown, Ohio, where entire communities depend on auto manufacturing jobs, the economic pain was immediate. But while car makers scrambled, the real losers were about to emerge: American workers. The economic fallout for workers and consumers. As the trade war escalated, American workers and consumers began to feel the impact firsthand. The layoffs that had started in auto manufacturing spread to related industries, including logistics, trucking, and retail. When an auto plant cuts production, it affects thousands of workers, not just those on the assembly line, but also those in shipping, warehousing, and supply chain management. Thousands of auto workers found themselves out of a job or working reduced hours, struggling to make ends meet. In cities and towns where auto manufacturing is the primary employer, the effects rippled outward. Restaurants, grocery stores, and small businesses that relied on steady income from factory workers saw a sharp decline in customers, leading to even more job losses. But the impact was not limited to factory towns. Consumers across the country suddenly faced rising car prices, with production costs increasing due to tariffs. Automakers had no choice but to pass those costs on to buyers. The price of an average new car in the United States jumped by thousands of dollars, pushing vehicles out of reach for many working-class families. Used cars became more expensive too, as more people held on to their existing vehicles rather than buying new ones. Meanwhile, financing rates increased, making it even harder for middle-class Americans to afford a car. What had once been a relatively stable market became volatile overnight, with dealerships struggling to predict demand and consumers delaying major purchases due to uncertainty. And it wasn't just cars. The broader economic ripple effects extended into everyday consumer goods. Many industries rely on Canadian raw materials and parts, meaning the tariffs increased costs across multiple sectors. Everything from household appliances to construction materials saw price hikes, hitting American families where it hurt the most: their wallets. But as tensions escalated, this trade war quickly turned political backlash and economic panic. As the trade war escalated, the political fallout in the United States became impossible to ignore. Lawmakers in key swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where auto manufacturing was a major employer, sounded the alarm. Thousands of jobs were at risk, and the rising cost of vehicle production threatened to push already struggling industries over the edge. Union leaders warned of potential plant closures, and factory workers feared they might be the next to receive a pink slip. Rather than backing down, the White House doubled down on its trade war strategy. Officials argued that the tariffs were a necessary tool to bring back American manufacturing and reduce dependence on foreign materials. The administration insisted that, in the long run, these measures would strengthen the domestic economy, even as immediate disruptions worsened. However, businesses and consumers felt the pain almost instantly. Meanwhile, Canada's government refused to cave to U.S. demands. Instead of seeking a compromise, Canadian officials issued a warning. If the United States escalated further, Ottawa was prepared to impose even tougher trade penalties. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau declared that Canada would not be bullied, rallying support from both domestic industries and international allies. The standoff created deep divisions in Washington. Some Republican lawmakers, particularly those in auto-heavy states, began pressuring the administration to negotiate. Democratic leaders, seizing on the economic turmoil, blamed the trade war for hurting American workers and accused the administration of reckless economic policies. Public sentiment shifted rapidly, with business groups, consumer advocates, and union leaders calling for an immediate resolution. But the auto industry wasn't the only one feeling the heat. Other key sectors were about to experience the ripple effects of this escalating trade war. Ripple effects across other industries. The U.S.-Canada trade dispute did not stop at cars. Steel and aluminum tariffs the backbone of many industries, began to wreak havoc across the economy. Construction companies, appliance manufacturers, and tech firms suddenly found their costs skyrocketing as raw materials became more expensive. Infrastructure projects stalled, businesses postponed expansions, and manufacturers scrambled to adjust their budgets. The agricultural sector also found itself caught in the crossfire. Canada, one of the largest buyers of American wheat, corn, and dairy products, retaliated by placing heavy tariffs on U.S. farm exports. The result was catastrophic for farmers, particularly in Midwestern states. Grain silos overflowed with unsold crops. Dairy producers struggled to offload their goods, and livestock farmers saw feed costs soar due to rising grain prices. Some family farms, already dealing with narrow profit margins, faced financial ruin. Retailers and logistics companies were hit just as hard. Higher import costs led to inflation, making everyday goods more expensive for consumers. Electronics, clothing, and household items saw price hikes, causing consumers to cut back on spending. As the trade war dragged on, retailers warned of declining sales, and some smaller businesses teetered on the brink of closure. Even industries not directly tied to manufacturing suffered. The hospitality sector experienced a slowdown in cross-border tourism, as weakened consumer confidence made people think twice about discretionary spending. Airlines and travel agencies reported a decline in bookings, particularly among business travelers who were hesitant to commit to uncertain trade relationships. Meanwhile, as American businesses scrambled to adapt, global competitors saw a golden opportunity to dominate the market. China and Europe seized the opportunity. While North America was locked in a bitter trade dispute, China and Europe saw an opening to expand their influence in the global auto industry. Chinese automakers and battery manufacturers ramped up production, offering competitive alternatives to American-made vehicles. The Chinese government, eager to position itself as a dominant force in the electric vehicle market, accelerated investments in lithium-ion battery production and rare earth minerals, materials crucial to modern auto manufacturing. In Europe, Germany and France capitalized on the instability. Major European automakers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Renault announced plans to increase exports to Asian and Middle Eastern markets, filling the void left by American automakers caught in the tariff war. European manufacturers offered stability to international buyers, making them a more attractive alternative compared to American firms struggling with supply chain issues. Japan also saw an opportunity to undercut U.S. automakers. Toyota, Nissan, and Honda diverted resources toward boosting production in non-U.S. markets, ensuring they remained competitive, even as American auto companies dealt with rising costs. The U.S. auto industry, once a symbol of industrial dominance, now faced the real risk of losing global influence. Some analysts predicted that if the trade war continued, American automakers could fall behind permanently, allowing China and Europe to lead the next generation of auto innovation. But just as the United States began to feel the pressure of global competition, Canada played its most powerful card yet, its energy dominance. Canada's secret weapon, energy sanctions. While tariffs on auto parts and manufacturing materials disrupted the U.S. economy, Canada held an even greater economic weapon, energy exports. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of crude oil, natural gas, and electricity to the United States, providing nearly 20% of America's total energy imports. This deep energy dependence made Canada's next move particularly devastating. In a bold warning, Canadian officials threatened to impose heavy restrictions on energy exports if the United States refused to negotiate. Such a move would have immediate and catastrophic consequences. Gas prices in the U.S. would skyrocket, home heating costs would surge, and factories reliant on Canadian energy could face severe slowdowns or even shutdowns. Some of the hardest-hit regions would be the Midwest and Northeast, which rely heavily on Canadian crude oil and electricity. States like New York, Michigan, and Illinois would experience supply shortages, forcing energy providers to seek alternative, more expensive sources. The impact on transportation and logistics would also be crippling, with diesel and aviation fuel prices soaring, increasing costs for shipping companies and airlines. The threat of energy sanctions sent shockwaves through Washington, forcing policymakers to reassess their strategy. Lawmakers from energy-dependent states immediately pushed for de-escalation, recognizing that a fuel crisis would devastate both businesses and consumers. The White House, however, remained resistant, refusing to publicly acknowledge the growing pressure. Internationally, this move positioned Canada as a major player in global energy markets. The possibility of Canada diverting its energy exports to Europe or Asia left the United States vulnerable. Other global energy powers, such as Saudi Arabia and Russia, watched closely, recognizing that North America's energy trade patterns could shift permanently. With the stakes now higher than ever, the question became clear. Could the United States afford to continue this economic standoff, or would they be forced to negotiate a truce? The US-Canada trade war had escalated far beyond just auto manufacturing, with jobs at risk, industries suffering, and global competitors gaining ground. The United States faced a crisis that extended into energy security and economic stability. The political battle in Washington grew more intense as lawmakers debated whether to fight or negotiate. Meanwhile, Canada held its ground, proving that it was willing to take bold action to protect its economy. With energy sanctions looming and public frustration mounting, the US now had a decision to make: continue the fight and risk deeper economic turmoil, or seek a diplomatic resolution before it was too late. But with both governments refusing to back down, the question remained: who would make the next move? But as tensions boiled over, it was the automakers, both American and Canadian, who demanded an urgent resolution. Automakers demand a resolution. The North American auto industry had been built on a tightly integrated supply chain, with parts crossing the border multiple times before a vehicle reached its final assembly. The introduction of tariffs had shattered this system overnight, leaving automakers scrambling to keep production lines moving. Major United States car manufacturers, including Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, were among the hardest hit. The increased costs of steel, aluminum, and essential electronic components meant that each vehicle was suddenly far more expensive to produce. Automakers had two options: either pass the cost on to consumers or absorb the losses and risk financial instability. Neither choice was sustainable in the long run. The automotive industry quickly pushed back against the White House, warning that the tariffs were crippling production and threatening thousands of American jobs. Executives from major car companies met with government officials, urging them to reconsider the trade restrictions. The message was clear: if this trade war continued, the United States auto sector could collapse. At the same time, Canadian automakers and suppliers were suffering as well. Factories in Ontario and Quebec, which had long been key suppliers of engines, batteries, and other components, found themselves cut off from their biggest market. Canadian officials made it clear that they were open to negotiations, but only if the United States reversed its auto tariffs. Despite the pressure from automakers, the political deadlock remained. Neither country wanted to be seen as the one that blinked first. With negotiations at a standstill, the economic damage continued to mount. It was becoming increasingly clear that North American trade was heading toward a breaking point. But then, in a shocking twist, Mexico stepped in with a move that no one saw coming. Mexico's surprising move. While the United States and Canada were locked in their trade battle, Mexico saw an opportunity. As a key partner in the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, Mexico had long played a crucial role in North American manufacturing. But as tensions between its two largest trade partners escalated, Mexican officials realized that they could shift the balance of power in their favor. In a bold and strategic move, Mexico announced new trade agreements with Canada and Europe. These deals aim to increase trade with European automakers while strengthening ties with Canadian manufacturers. This meant that Mexico was no longer solely dependent on the United States for its automotive industry, a decision that sent shockwaves through the American economy. For American automakers, this was a nightmare scenario. Many United States car manufacturers had already been moving production to Mexico due to lower labor costs. With Mexico now forming stronger economic ties with Canada and Europe, the United States auto industry was left increasingly vulnerable. Companies that had relied on the USMCA agreement to ensure smooth trade now faced massive uncertainties about their future. The impact of Mexico's shift was felt immediately. European automakers saw an opening to invest in Mexico, knowing that the country now had unrestricted access to both the European and Canadian markets. This new economic alignment meant that American automakers were no longer the dominant force in North America. The United States suddenly faced the possibility of losing its grip on the global auto industry, with Mexico now offering a more stable trade environment and Canada looking toward alternative markets. The United States found itself increasingly isolated. The consequences were catastrophic. If this trend continued, American car manufacturers could be permanently sidelined on the global stage. But whether a resolution is reached or not, one thing is certain. This trade war has already changed the United States auto industry forever. The rise of Canada's auto industry. As the dust settled from the intense trade war, a surprising winner began to emerge: Canada. While the United States struggled with supply chain disruptions and rising production costs, Canada seized the opportunity to reshape its auto industry. The country quickly positioned itself as a more stable, investor-friendly alternative, attracting billions in foreign investment from European and Asian manufacturers. With deep expertise in electric vehicle production, battery technology, and sustainable manufacturing, Canada became a preferred destination for automakers looking to avoid the unpredictability of U.S. tariffs, as companies sought alternatives to American factories. Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia saw a surge in new manufacturing facilities, creating thousands of jobs in the process. Beyond attracting automakers, Canada also worked to diversify its trade partnerships. With American tariffs making trade more difficult, Canada expanded its agreements with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea. This move ensured that Canadian auto exports had a strong global market, reducing reliance on the U.S. and shielding its economy from future trade disputes. By focusing on innovation, energy efficiency, and international cooperation, Canada proved its resilience in the face of economic adversity. What once seemed like a retaliatory move had instead strengthened Canada's position in the global auto market, allowing it to compete with some of the largest auto-producing nations. But with so much at stake, many leaders began pushing for a resolution. Could a new trade deal bring stability back to the U.S. auto industry? Will the U.S. and Canada repair their trade relations? As economic losses mounted on both sides, pressure grew for the U.S. and Canada to renegotiate their trade terms. Business leaders from both nations lobbied for a revision of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, arguing that the original deal had become outdated due to evolving industry needs and geopolitical tensions. While American automakers struggled, Canadian manufacturers flourished, leading Washington to reconsider its stance on tariffs and trade barriers. The U.S. government, recognizing that the ongoing conflict was damaging domestic businesses, initiated talks with Canadian officials to explore potential compromises. One of the key proposals was to reduce tariffs on auto parts and raw materials to restore supply chain efficiency. Automakers in the U.S. were struggling to maintain production costs, and the increased expenses on imported Canadian materials had led to inflated car prices. By easing these tariffs, both countries could re-establish the free flow of goods, stabilizing the industry and preventing further economic downturns. Another major point of discussion was the creation of joint incentives for electric vehicle production. With China rapidly expanding its dominance in the EV market, North America risked falling behind in automotive innovation. A proposed solution involved both the U.S. and Canada working together to offer subsidies for electric vehicle manufacturers, research institutions, and battery production plants. This would not only help North American automakers compete globally, but also drive investments into the clean energy sector. Trade fairness was also a significant issue. U.S. lawmakers pushed for a re-establishment of fair trade practices to prevent future economic retaliation. The concern was that Canada's ability to leverage tariffs in response to U.S. policies could set a precedent for further trade disputes. In response, negotiators sought to develop a structured dispute resolution process that would allow both countries to address trade disagreements without resorting to retaliatory tariffs. This would provide long-term stability for businesses and prevent future economic disruptions. Despite growing calls for a settlement, some political figures resisted renegotiation, arguing that relaxing tariffs would make the U.S. look weak. Others, particularly those representing auto manufacturing states, demanded an immediate resolution, warning that further delays could cause permanent damage to the American workforce. Trade analysts predicted that while an eventual agreement was likely, it would take time to rebuild trust and economic stability between the two countries. In the meantime, foreign competitors continued to gain an advantage, and no country was better positioned to capitalize on the North American trade war than China. While the US and Canada struggled to mend relations, China was quietly reshaping the future of the global auto industry. Will China dominate the global auto market? As North America remained embroiled in trade disputes, China rapidly expanded its dominance in the global auto market with unmatched production capacity, government-backed subsidies, and aggressive international expansion. Chinese automakers positioned themselves as the future leaders of the automotive world. One of the key areas where China surged ahead was electric vehicle production. While US automakers dealt with supply chain instability, Chinese manufacturers like BYD, NIO, and Geely aggressively ramped up EV battery production and vehicle exports, particularly to Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Additionally, China's access to rare earth metals, which are crucial for EV batteries, semiconductors, and advanced auto technology, gave it a massive strategic advantage. With North America struggling to secure raw materials, China used its resource control to outmaneuver competitors and dominate the global supply chain. Beyond electric vehicles, China formed new trade partnerships with nations that once relied on the US for auto manufacturing. African, Middle Eastern, and South American countries increasingly turned to China for affordable vehicles and infrastructure investments, further solidifying its influence. As a result, many industry experts warned that if North America did not resolve its trade disputes soon, China would cement its position as the world's leading auto powerhouse, leaving the US and Canada permanently behind in the race for automotive innovation. So, is this just the beginning of a new world order in global trade? Will the US and Canada recover, or has China already won the auto industry battle? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.